So as I said, I sell stuff, so this is where the rubber hits the road. So being here is actually quite nostalgic. So 2 years ago, just over 2 years ago, we used the same venue for our channel partner event. And just to put things in perspective, so we have about 30,000 partners across APJ. That's excluding China, 30,000. And in 2016, we achieved a goal just over APJ, over $3 billion. That's through partners. Okay, so you can imagine, we talk about small kind of shops, outfits, some of them small as yours, but the fact is they delivered. So my background really is, I know we spoke about proprietary and against proprietary. So my background is, I work for Unisys, and back then it was Unix, system 5.2, and then moved on 5.4. Worked on SEO Unix as well back then, before moving on to kind of more standard, enterprise platforms at Compaq and HP. So I want to reintroduce you to Intel, talk about our relationship with, of course, with Red Hat and the other partners that we have in the room here, and just talk about opportunities, technology opportunities, and hopefully we can actually work together and increase, of course, the collaboration we have with our ecosystem. So what's our vision there? So the collaboration that we enjoy with Red Hat actually spans about 25 years or even longer. It's about 25 years, actually. Intel, by the way, is celebrating 50 years next week, 50 years. Okay, so collaboration of 25 years. And basically, what's the premise of the collaboration with Red Hat? Basically, we actually create innovation, which obviously helps you differentiate, create revenue. You heard about the top line and bottom line. So you can differentiate, make money, hopefully, and of course, also reduce your risk. That's basically what the collaboration is about. Looking at the history then, I think you can read that, but certainly we invested, some of you might or might not know, so we invested in Red Hat back in '98, and of course, since then, the relationship actually blossomed. You heard about disruption. So I want to talk about our experience with disruption, and you can read some of the numbers out there. So I would say about 2 decades ago, 80% of our revenue actually came from 3 customers, just 3 customers, hardware vendors. That was 2 decades ago. Today, 80% of our revenue comes from about 4 times that, or if not even more. Okay, so it's basically disruption. So if you look at basically the companies that we deal with, the customers that we enjoy relationships with, contributing to 80% of our revenue has actually expanded over time, 4x. But as it says there, so I'll quote IDC again. So 50% of global GDP will be digitized by 2021. I'll share a few other facts that you don't see there as well. So by 2021, 40% of the top 20 companies in every industry will be disrupted. Okay, so that's really, think about the disruption. So what can you actually do about the disruption? We'll talk more about that in the coming slides. The other thing is, we spoke about artificial intelligence earlier on. So by 2021, again, about 150 million jobs will be impacted by bots, or in other words, artificial intelligence. Not to say that those basically is creating unemployment, it just means that those jobs move more towards a services-oriented economy. So look at the principles of digital transformation for a minute. I'll talk more about this in some depth. But as you see, the hybrid cloud. So our experience with hybrid cloud, of course, we're moving to a multi-cloud environment. So within Intel itself, we have a chief cloud broker. So his only job is to find where to actually place those workloads most economically and effectively for Intel. So within Intel itself, we have about 110,000 servers. So we have more servers than actual employees in the company. There's 110,000 servers, over 64 data centers. Of course, we could do all the work in 110,000 servers itself, but we still economically use a hybrid cloud model. So the broker really sees, again, where effectively we can actually place these workloads. So I think that's key, and we'll talk more about that. The other one is virtualized network. Excuse me. So moving towards a virtualized network. So here, obviously, we're talking about NFV, and we're talking about SDN. Talk about that in a couple of minutes as well. A really key one is data storage. So think of the infrastructure that you have today. Intel itself is reinventing itself to become more a data company. Okay, the data company, everyone claims that they're becoming a data company. Data is actually becoming even more crucial. I'll give you an example. So I presented to one of the large motor manufacturers in Europe. And for the first time in the room, there wasn't only kind of the IT-savvy folks. We had legal, we had a bunch of people from HR and so forth. So I was pretty surprised by the kind of the audience. So after I finished my presentation was about autonomous strategy and how we could actually help them, talking about autonomous driving, of course. The big question asked was, who owns the data? So our premise as Intel, obviously, we're building these big data centers, providing the storage that we'd be able to monetize the data. So, of course, the discussion came up that the auto manufacturers own the data. So you can imagine moving forward, data is becoming really key. Okay, so we've made some big investments, and I'll spend a few minutes talking about some really key, probably not announced it, some key storage technologies that we're actually launching by the end of this year. Analytics and AI strategy, how do you actually monetize that data? Do you know that with all the data collected, and there's obviously petabytes, and we all know the facts that data actually, the accumulation of data actually increases, 2x, 3x every year. But the fact is, collecting all the data, only 5% of the data is actually being utilized. But I say utilized, in other words, analyzed and being monetized. Okay, so where do you actually draw your differentiations from the data that you collect? And the last one is about multi-layered security. So when we refer to multi-layered security, sure, I'm not just talking about this particular, whether it's semantics, product or McAfee's product, but I'm talking about, from the ground up. So when I say multi-tier, we're actually talking about from the BIOS level, the hardware, okay, all the way up to the operating system and software. So you need to have a 3-tier strategy at the minimum to actually ensure that your data is secure. So again, just looking at the collaboration areas with Red Hat and, of course, the ecosystem, with some of you in the room here today. When you think of Intel, you think of Intel as a chip company. And, of course, sure, we do actually manufacture chips, silicon. Okay, so talking of disruption, there's another key point. It costs about $6 billion to actually build up a fab to manufacture silicon, to manufacture chips. So guess what? So if you think about it, the barriers to entry are pretty high, but you are actually in a key position. You don't have to concern yourself with those barriers to entry. So we actually envy you. The fact is your barriers to entry are low because you're actually developing software. I'm not saying it's an easy task. At the same time, you have the ability to generate recurring revenue. Once we've sold silicon, we've sold it, it's gone, right? So in your case, you can actually still generate recurring revenue through licensing, services, and so forth. But firstly, if you look at built on Intel technology, so our work with Red Hat and the ecosystem is not just about that CPU. So we look at providing you the package. So we look at all the silicon available. So whether it's in the network, of course, the CPU, it's a fabric, it's the graphics, security, and so forth. But we also work up and down the stack. So if you look at some of the software stacks, working with the likes of Red Hat, of course, other vendors like yourselves in the room here today. Okay, so it's around about three, let's call it the 3 tenets. Really, the one is about the cloud infrastructure. That's obviously a big focus for us. The second one, again, is about NFV. And the last one around storage. Storage is still a big deal for us. I'll talk about that again in a couple of minutes. So these really are the 3 pillars of our organization. Our revenue goals for this year, by the way, globally is $60 billion, just over $60 billion. So the transformation of the company, if you think about it, we started obviously selling chips for mobile, let's say notebooks and desktops and so forth, before moving into the data center environments. So you see a shift in our revenue from the client side. Okay, I'm talking about contribution as a ratio of revenue from the client side to the data center. So our goal for the data center side on revenue is about over $20 billion. Okay, so just think about it. And where's that revenue coming from? Firstly, there's a demand from enterprise for MIPS. Okay, so demand for MIPS could be coming from on-prem or off-prem. Okay, so we see the shift, obviously, to off-prem initially, And of course, some of it came back on, and now we see this hybrid infrastructure. But the fact is, if you see the demand, it's actually, for MIPS, is actually growing exponentially year on year. So what's our vision, really? And I think you'll find this interesting. You heard a couple of presentations earlier that might have alluded to this. It's about the virtuous cycle of growth. Okay, firstly, it's about the cloud and data center. Okay, with the cloud and data center, obviously you build up the infrastructure to actually deliver services, and the services that's actually created by you folk. The second thing is you have these devices, Internet of Things, at the bottom end there, okay, in the virtuous cycle of growth. So the Internet of Things, we're talking about PCs, whether it's desktops, laptops, we're talking about sensors. So anything that can connect, that's smart, okay, connects to the data center. So when your mobile phone, for example, is apps written for that, when you actually connect to the data center using services, okay, and the more services you demand, the more the hosts have to build up their data centers to supply the service. So it becomes a virtuous cycle of growth. Okay, the one feeds off the other. But in between that, of course, the connecting tissue is really connectivity. So the connectivity we're talking about, of course, is we're talking about high-performance fabric within the data center, and of course, the move to 5G. So 5G is actually on the horizon. And this is where I see big opportunities for you as well on 5G. We're working with a bunch of telco providers within the region as well. We were one of the technology providers to the Winter Olympics in Korea recently, where we actually installed a POC on 5G. And guess what? It actually worked quite well. Summer Olympics in Japan will obviously be a technology provider as well, using 5G. So what are we seeing with telco providers? We saw there was this shift, obviously, the infrastructure to 3G and the support thereof. And there was a big data center build-out, and we all benefited from that. We see a kind of a slight decline, and I say decline in growth. They're still obviously spending. But we see the next big push in telcos infrastructure investment will be 5G, and that's on the horizon. The next one is, how do you actually connect even, let's call it from east to west within the data centers itself, right? Because if you look at the large data centers, I mentioned we have about 64 data centers, but within data centers themselves, and you're working closely with the likes of Microsoft on certain technology that you see there, in terms of how do you connect one rack to another at the highest speed with the lowest possible, with the highest possible bandwidth with lowest latency. So these are just some of the technologies that we're working on. There's a whole host of, I suppose, in the interest of time, I won't go through all of them, but you see it's beyond just the hardware. So there's software as well. I mentioned autonomous driving. Now imagine the, just one car, the amount of data that it would create on a daily basis. It's huge. And think of this particular vehicle going through the streets, passing particular shops. It's accumulating this data because you have sensors, and of course it has vision. We acquired a company called Mobileye for about $15 billion recently because we actually see the potential of this data collection and autonomous driving moving forward. So hopefully this gives you a big picture of Intel's portfolio of products. So again, from the processors, I mentioned, for example, chipsets, the fabrics, ASICs, graphics, and so forth. So again, we look at the whole picture. In other words, providing you the whole silicon solution. At the same time, working up and down the stack. Okay, I'm going to keep this lighthearted because it's almost lunchtime. But my favorite one, there's the Intel Data Analytics Acceleration Library, affectionately known as DAL, okay, because it's close to lunchtime. Some of you might recognize what I mean by that. But certainly, seriously, we provide you with the instructions, we provide the libraries, as you can see from that, management, orchestration tools, but it's not actually competing against the likes of our partners. This is actually providing them the tools, the assets. Okay, so obviously there's still software that sits on top of that even further. So this actually just enables the partners to actually deliver more effective, cost-effective solutions, and importantly, reducing the risk. It's about standards-based. And why do we actually do this? Firstly, it's about the workloads. Again, everything is built around workloads. I'll talk more about that in a couple of seconds. It's about the workloads. So we design products and technology to effectively manage those workloads better. In other words, performance-wise, stability-wise, right? Reliability, and of course, scalability, which is really key for us. So that's what it's about, really. Now, open source. So what's the relevance of Intel to open source? Besides the collaboration that we have with Red Hat, obviously there's other partners. So looking at, for example, graphics, connectivity, Bluetooth, one of the major contributors to Bluetooth, likewise with Ethernet, operating system, multiple operating systems, including Linux. Data center clouds, you heard the presentations earlier about containers, Kubernetes, so we work closely on that as well. Same with Hadoop. I'm just picking a few key ones that we worked on because I've actually worked on some of these personally in terms of the sales cycle. So there's a whole host of them. The key one really is about devices and IoT. So when you think IoT, think of the sensors and just the Internet of Things, just things which are smart and connected. Think of the data that it actually generates. And the data generates how you could actually monetize that moving forward. Of course, that's where analytics comes in. I just want to share one example with you. So we all know that we're being watched, more frequently than before. I'm talking about surveillance, digital surveillance. Right, so you have cameras just about everywhere you look, especially in some of the cities that I travel into, like, say, London, even in parts of Munich and so forth. But you're being watched all the time. I feel safe by that, but it's intrusive in a way. But the fact is, what actually happens to this data? So this data is collected, okay? And it's not actually analyzed the way it should be today. There's still a lot of intelligence required. And a lot of that, by the way, is done at the back end, all the analytics. But the idea is to actually move that back end to the front end. So in other words, can you do the analytics at the camera or even closer to the camera? Okay, think of the real-time kind of analytics you could do and the information you could actually get, offhand. Of course, they could sell some of this data, which becomes more questionable then, right? But the fact is, this is reality. So I'm going to touch on a few emerging technologies, just 3 of them. So I'll take just a couple of minutes on those. These are the ones that I guess I'm most passionate about, because these are on the horizon. And these are the ones I think you have the ability, to monetize as quickly as possible. So the first one is something we already launched. It's what we call the Scalable Processor. So why is this important? So firstly, there's been a shift. I would call it a seismic shift from Moore's Law. So Moore's Law is still alive. So Moore's Law, I think you're familiar with. So every 2 years, the performance of our processors doubles. In fact, the whole IT infrastructure is actually dependent on Moore's Law. But we're moving more towards the services that we can actually provide through the silicon. And I think this is where you can benefit. So yes, we call it speeds and feeds. So frequency, cache size, all that's still relevant, right? Number of cores. But what's really key, if you look at this slide, and this is relevant to OpenShift in particular, number of sockets. So in other words, number of sockets and amount of memory you support. It's about scale up. So the more memory you support, the more you can scale up. Okay, SAP HANA, for example, benefits tremendously from this. Quick assist technology. So it's about accelerators, within the processor itself. It gives you better performance. Translation is actually much quicker. So you're actually offloading a lot from the core CPU itself onto some of the silicon outside that. It's still part of the core, but it actually offloads some of that frequency. So I think that's key. The other one is around, and this is where you could benefit if you're actually writing code, around the advanced vector extensions. So there, again, it's about services. You can actually monetize some of the services available on the silicon. One of the service providers, actually there's about 2 or 3 of them, top service providers. This is how we tier them. So you have your top 10, which includes Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and obviously the top 3 from China. And then you have what we call the next wave. So they've actually realized how to monetize and create services using the Intel silicon. And they generate recurring revenue from this. Now remember, we sold the silicon just once. They've actually purchased it from us once, but they've created services which gives them recurring revenue. So isn't that amazing? So I think, you should actually start thinking about how you monetize some of the, let's say, some of the potential from the silicon itself when you start developing your apps. Resource directors, about how do you actually manage your infrastructure. We're developing a new technology, which you'll see probably in about 2 years' time, but it's not in its infancy. It's been in the make for quite a while, and you see products in the market. We're moving beyond managing the nodes or managing the server to managing racks and managing the data center. So we've introduced technology called rack scale design. Okay, so in other words, shifting to see the bigger picture. So how do you, for example, and of course there's technologies available today, but we've actually taken this again down to the silicon level. How do you actually manage your entire data center into pools, basically pools of compute, storage, and networking? And how do you actually make this flexible? What's key moving forward, though, is intelligence and orchestration. So we're using Redfish APIs today, if you're familiar with those APIs, but we're using the Redfish API today, and of course working on basically open source APIs as well. But what we're looking at really is, how do you actually manage this data center by telemetry? So we have telemetry actually built into the silicon. So this telemetry actually feeds up data, and you have the ability, using artificial intelligence, to preempt, okay, what's workloads consume how much basically of your resources at any given time during the day or month. Okay, so that's the whole idea behind rack scale design. The other technology, now think about this. Look at the 42U rack full of hard drives. Okay, that's 42, that's an entire rack, right? It's taller than I am. And look at what you see on the other side, which is a 1U basically nodes of 1 petabyte. Okay, so that 1U node is going to replace an entire 42U rack of storage. Okay, and of course, when you're thinking, software-defined storage, you're looking at basically, the ability to actually have more storage in a denser space. What does it actually do? Think about the savings in terms of space, power consumption, management, and the list goes on. Okay, so this you'll see, actually we have, samples, we've been talking to, obviously, some of the vendors on this, some of them have actually embraced this technology already. So it's what we call the ruler kind of SSDs, right? Again, 1U, 1 petabyte. This is amazing technology. The last technology I want to talk to you about is, and this is really innovative, so we haven't quite launched it yet, so you won't find this product out yet. We're in kind of beta phase. We're doing proof of concepts. We're looking for willing customers and partners. So think of it this way. You're all familiar with memory and storage. So you have your CPU with cache. Then you have your DRAM, which is pretty expensive. Okay, high performance, low latency. And then you have your drives, whether you're using SSDs, hard disk drives, the opticals, and so forth. Okay, so, but moving forward, we're actually looking at how do you, for example, and by the way, memory is really expensive. I mean, sales, I know this. Memory is really expensive. In most cases, it contributes about 50% of the BOM cost of the hardware today, which means there's less money for your software. Okay, so we think of how do you actually increase the amount of memory available in a server infrastructure while reducing the cost. So, of course, IT infrastructure then could, they could spend more, I suppose, money on the software and services that hopefully that you'll be providing them. So this technology you'll see coming out in the future with latest CPU support. What's really important is when I talk to CTOs or CXO level, and there's a couple of concerns they have, and I'm sure they shared this with you as well. Okay, they worry about workloads, firstly. What type of workloads is becoming more complex? Where do they actually place those workloads? On-prem, off-prem, hybrid environments. That's hopefully part of their strategy anyway. But importantly as well, how do you actually, glue the hardware and software, together, including the applications and services? So we're trying to make this easier. So working with the likes of our partners, like Red Hat, Microsoft, and so forth, we're trying to address this. So common questions you get is, how do I get everything integrated and working well together? In other words, if I want to refresh or just expand my data center, redeploy more infrastructure, what's the simplest way of doing this without all the headaches in the background? We have a solution for that. It's called Intel Select Solutions. So basically, it's an Intel verified solution. So it's got the hardware, software, it tells you the entire configuration, provides you the solution blueprints, so it makes it easier for IT managers to deploy. So it's evaluated already by Intel with our partners. It's fast and easy to deploy because you get the solution blueprints, which actually tells you the parameters and the specs that should be set up already. And it's already workload optimized. So you find configurations for specific workloads. Examples. With Red Hat, there's the NFVI, and of course, you're working on a few others. We have reference architectures around, for example, OpenShift. So there's a whole bunch of them. I won't go through all of them. We have some of them on cloud, some of them around genomics, high-performance computing. Okay, so basically, think of it as a predefined bundle that you could actually readily deploy with confidence at your site. Right, so why Intel for your IT transformation, or digital transformation for that matter? So we're saying we know the future because we created, we're building it. And to a great extent we are. Think of Moore's Law. Give you another equation there. So if, just say the motor industry actually tracks pace with Moore's Law in the IT industry. Okay, remember, we're a 50-year-old company. Moore's Law has been there from the 70s, and we have double performance every 24 months. Okay, if the motor industry did that, you'd actually be able to purchase a Rolls-Royce for $1 today, based on the performance and the specs that you get and bang for your buck. So coming back to this, though, we're a unique partner because we're agnostic. So we work with all the vendors. We actually create basically the platform, okay, for you to deliver on. The second one is cloud leadership. So the cloud is actually built on Intel, and that's a reality. Okay. So in some cases, some of the cloud service providers prefer direct relationship with Intel, where we provide them basically, the fabric that they require. Of course, it goes through ODMs and OEMs. Enterprise IT experience, 140,000 servers. We have about, 100,000 employees at Intel. We have 140,000 servers, 64 data centers. So if you actually go into Intel's websites, there's IT at Intel. So we have best-known methods and practices from our own IT specialists within Intel that actually provides these solutions. And the ecosystem, Red Hat, Microsoft, HP, Dell, Lenovo, and so forth, that's here, the booths are over there. So we actually work closely with the ecosystem. I think, if you look at the expertise that we've actually gained by working with the ecosystem and working with customers, I think this will actually help you when you actually develop your systems. And really, so my call to action to you, join us. Okay, so join us. I mean, we have 30,000 partners today. We've created what we call specialist tracks. So where there's data center specialists, HPC specialists, high-performance computing specialists, and cloud specialists. Okay, so that's part of the 30,000 that I mentioned earlier. But separately, we have the builders tracks. So we have, for example, artificial intelligence builders. What's your expectations from these builders tracks, basically? So you find the best-known methods. You'll find predefined solutions. There's universities, so you could actually attend the training. By the way, there's no financial commitment or obligation to you. It's free of charge. So take the time to actually sign up and just look at what's relevant for you, whether it's NFV or data center specific or even cloud. So in cloud, if you are actually a CSP in the audience, we have something called the Cloud Insider Program, where you have basically other CSPs, like-minded CSPs, who contribute, okay, their information, solution, blueprints, reference architectures, and so forth. Intel also invests in, obviously some of the companies like yourselves. So we have like $1 billion funds for artificial intelligence builders. Okay, so my key message to you is join us. Okay, we'd like to extend, the ecosystem to include you as well, like we have with the other partners. So thank you for your time.